Hi, Kent Lake. It's Mrs. Hemker here. I will be reading to you from the BFG, The Snatch. Under the blanket, Sophie waited. After a minute or so, she lifted a corner of the blanket and peeped out. For the second time that night, her blood froze to ice and she wanted to scream, but no sound came out. There at the window, with the curtains pushed aside, was the enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face of the giant person staring in. The flashing black eyes were fixed on Sophie's bed. The next moment, a huge hand with pale fingers came snaking in through the window. This was followed by an arm as thick as a tree trunk. And the arm, the hand, the fingers were reaching out across the room towards Sophie's bed. This time, Sophie really did scream, but for only a second, because very quickly the huge hand clamped down over her blanket and the scream was smothered by the bedclothes. Sophie, crouching beneath the blanket, felt strong fingers grasping hold of her, and then she was lifted up from her bed, blanket and all, and whisked out of the window. If you can think of anything more terrifying than that happening to you in the middle of the night, then let's hear about it. The awful thing was that Sophie knew exactly what was going on, although she couldn't see it happening. She knew that a monster, or giant, with an enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face and dangerous eyes had plucked her from her bed in the middle of the witching hour and was now carrying her out through the window, smothered in a blanket. What actually happened next was this. When the giant had got Sophie outside, he arranged the blanket so that he could grasp all four corners of it at once in one of his huge hands, with Sophie imprisoned inside. In the other hand, he seized the suitcase and the long trumpet thing and ran off. Sophie, by squirming around inside the blanket, managed to push the top of her head out through a little gap just below the giant's hand. She stared around her. She saw the village houses rushing by on both sides. The giant was sprinting down the high street. He was running so fast that his black cloak was streaming out behind him like the wings of a bird. Each stride he took was as long as a tennis court. Out of the village he ran, and soon they were racing across the moonlit fields. The hedges dividing the fields were no problem to the giant. He simply strode over them. A wide river appeared in his path. He crossed it in one flying stride. Sophie crouched in the blanket, peering out. She was being bumped against the giant's giant leg like a sack of potatoes. Over the fields and hedges and rivers they went, and after a while, a frightening thought came into Sophie's head. The giant is running fast, she told herself, because he is hungry. And he wants to get home as quickly as possible, and then he'll have me for breakfast. That is a scary thought. Here's the picture of the giant running, holding Sophie. I hope you enjoy the next part.
Hi, everyone. It's Mrs. Rentz. I teach 5th grade here at Kent Lake. For those of you that don't know me, I will be reading pages 20 through 24, and the chapter title is The Cave. The giant ran on, but now a curious change took place in his way of running. He seemed suddenly to go into a higher gear. Faster and faster he went, and soon he was traveling at such a speed that the landscape became blurred. The wind stung Sophie's cheeks. It made her eyes water. It whipped her head back and whistled in her ears. She could no longer feel the giant's feet touching the ground. She had a weird sensation they were flying. It was impossible to tell whether they were over land or sea. This giant had some sort of magic in his legs. The wind rushing against Sophie's face became so strong that she had to duck down again into the blanket to prevent her head from being blown away. Was it really possible that they were crossing oceans? It certainly felt that way to Sophie. She crouched in the blanket and listened to the howling of the wind. It went on for what seemed like hours. Then, all at once, the wind stopped its howling. The pace began to slow down. Sophie could feel the giant's feet pounding once again over the earth. She poked her head up out of the blanket to have a look. They were in a country of thick forests and rushing rivers. The giant had definitely slowed down and was now running more normally, although normal was a silly word to use to describe a galloping giant. He leaped over a dozen rivers. He went rattling through a great forest, then down into a valley and up over a range of hills as bare as concrete. And soon he was galloping over a desolate wasteland that was not quite of this earth. The ground was flat and pale yellow. Great lumps of blue rock were scattered everywhere, and dead trees stood everywhere like skeletons. The moon had long since disappeared, and now the dawn was breaking. Sophie, still peering out from the blanket, saw suddenly ahead of her a great craggy mountain. The mountain was dark blue, and all around it the sky was gushing and glistening with light. Bits of pale gold were flying among delicate, frosty white flakes of cloud, and over to one side the rim of the morning sun was coming up red as blood. Right beneath the mountain, the giant stopped. He was puffing mightily. His great chest was heaving in and out. He paused to catch his breath. Directly in front of them, lying against the side of the mountain, Sophie could see a massive round stone. It was as big as a house. The giant reached out and rolled the stone to one side as easily as if it had been a football. And now, where the stone had been, there appeared a vast black hole. The hole was so large the giant didn't even have to duck his head as he went in. He strode into the black hole, still carrying Sophie in one hand, the trumpet and the suitcase in the other. As soon as he was inside, he stopped and turned and rolled the great stone back into place so that the entrance to his secret cave was completely hidden from outside. Now that the entrance had been sealed up, there was not a glint of light inside the cave. All was black. Sophie felt herself being lowered to the ground. Then the giant let go of the blanket completely. His footsteps moved away. Sophie sat there in the dark, shivering with fear. "He's getting ready to eat me," she told herself. "He will probably eat me raw, just as I am. Or perhaps he will boil me first. Or he will have me fried. He will drop me like a rasher of bacon into some gigantic frying pan sizzling with fat." A blaze of light suddenly lit up the whole place. Sophie blinked and stared. She saw an enormous cavern with a high rocky roof. The walls on either side were lined with shelves, and on the shelves there stood row upon row of glass jars. There were jars everywhere. They were piled up in the corners. They filled every nook and cranny of the cave. In the middle of the floor there was a table, 12 feet high, and a chair to match. The giant took off his black cloak and hung it against the wall. Sophie saw that under the cloak he was wearing a sort of collarless shirt and a dirty old leather waistcoat that didn't seem to have any buttons. His trousers were faded green and were far too short in the legs. On his bare feet he was wearing a pair of ridiculous sandals that for some reason had holes cut along each side, with a large hole at the end where his toes stuck out. Sophie, crouching on the floor of the cave in her nightie, gazed back at him through thick steel-rimmed glasses. She was trembling like a leaf in the wind, and a finger of ice was running up and down the length of her spine. "Ha!" shouted the giant, walking forward and rubbing his hands together. "What has us got here?" His booming voice rolled around the walls of the cave like a burst of thunder. And that's the end of my section. I hope you all are enjoying the book, and I'll see you soon.
The BFG. The giant picked up the trembling Sophie with one hand and carried her across the cave and put her on the table. "Now he is really going to eat me," Sophie thought. The giant sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as the wheel of a truck, and he seemed to be able to move them inward and outward from his head as he wished. "I is hungry," the giant boomed. He grinned, showing massive square teeth. The teeth were very white and very square, and they sat in his mouth like huge slices of white bread. Please don't eat me, Sophie stammered. The giant let out a bellow of laughter. Ha! Just because I is a giant, you don't think I is a man-gobbling cannibal, he shouted. You is about right. Giants is all cannibals is murderful, and they does gobble up human beings. We in giant country now, giants is everywhere around. Out there, us has the famous bone-crunching giant. Bone-crunching giant crunches up 2 whoopsie-whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noise is ear-busting. Noise of crunching bones that goes crackety-crack for miles around. Ouch, Sophie said. Bone-crunching giant only gobbles human beings from Turkey, the giant said. Every night, Bone Cruncher is galloping off to Turkey to gobble Turks. Sophie's sense of patriotism was suddenly so bruised by this remark that she became quite angry. Why Turks? She blurted out. What's wrong with the English? Bone-crunching giant says Turks is tasting ever so much juicier and more scrumdiddlyumptious. Bone Cruncher says Turkish human beings has a glamourly flavor. He says Turks from Turkey is tasting of turkey. I suppose they would, Sophie said. Of course they would, the giant shouted. Every human being is diddly and different. Some is scrumdiddlyumptious and some is uckly slush. Greeks is all full of ucky slush. No giant is eating Greeks ever. Why not? Sophie asked. Greeks from Greece is all tasting greasy, and the giant said. I imagine that's possible too, Sophie said. She was wondering with a bit of tremble what all this talking about eating people was leading up to. Whatever happened, she simply must play along with this peculiar giant and smile at his jokes. But were they jokes? Perhaps the great brute was just working up an appetite by talking about food. As I am saying, the giant went on, all human beings is having different flavors. Human beings from Panama is tasting very strong of hats. Why hats? Sophie said. You is not very clever, the giant said, moving his great ears in and out. I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your head is emptier than a bundongle. Do you like vegetables? Sophie asked, hoping to steer the conversation toward a slightly less dangerous kind of food. You is trying to change the subject, the giant said sternly. We is having an interesting babblement about the taste of human being. The human being is not a vegetable. Oh, but the bean is a vegetable, Sophie said. Not the human being, said the giant. The human being has 2 legs and a vegetable has no legs at all. Sophie didn't argue anymore. The last thing she wanted to do was make the giant cross. The human being, the giant went on, is coming in dillions of different flavors. For instance, human beings from Wales is tasting whooshly of fish. There is something very fishy about whales. You mean whales? Sophie said. Whales is something quite different. Whales is whales, the giant said. Don't gobble funk around with words. I will now give you another example. Human beings from Jersey have a most disgustable woolly tickle on the tongue, the giant said. Human beings from Jersey is tasting of cardigans. You mean jerseys, Sophie said. You are once again gobble funking, the giant shouted. Don't do it. This is a serious and snitching subject. May I continue? Please do, Sophie said. Danes from Denmark is tasting ever so much of the dogs, the giant went on. Of course, Sophie said. They taste of Great Danes. Wrong, cried the giant, slapping his thigh. Danes from Denmark is tasting doggy because they taste of Labradors. Then what do the people of Labrador taste like? Sophie asked. Danes, the giant cried triumphantly. Great Danes. Aren't you getting a bit mixed up? Sophie asked. I is a very mixed up giant, the giant said, but I does do my best. And I know I is not nearly as mixed up as the other giants. I know who gallops all the way to Wellington for his supper. Wellington? Sophie asked. Where is Wellington? Your head is full of squashed flies, the giant said. Wellington is in New Zealand. The human being beans in Wellington has especially scrumdiddlyumptious taste. So does the welly-eaten giant. What do the people of Wellington taste of? Sophie asked. Boots, said the giant. Of course, Sophie said. I should have known. Sophie decided that this conversation has now gone on long enough. If she was going to be eaten, she'd rather get it over and done with right away than being kept hanging around anymore. What sort of human beings do you eat? She asked, trembling. Me, shouted the giant, his mighty voice making the glass jars rattle on their shelves. Me gobbling up human beings? This I never. The others, yes, all the others is gobbling them up every night, but not me. I is a freaky giant. I is a nice and jumbly giant. I is the only nice and jumbly giant in giant country. I is the big friendly giant. I is the BFG. What is your name? My name is Sophie, Sophie said, hardly daring to believe the good news she had just heard.
Hi, Star Leaders. Ms. Fletmeyer here to continue our school read aloud, the BFG. We are going to be starting on page 31, and this section is titled The Giants. But if you are so nice and friendly, Sophie said, then why did you snatch me from my bed and run away with me? Because you saw me, the big friendly giant answered. If anyone is ever seeing a giant, he or she must be taken away hip switch. Why? Asked Sophie. Well, first of all, said the BFG, human beings is not really believing in giants, is they? Human beings is not thinking we exist. I do, Sophie said. Ah, but that is only because you have seen me, cried the BFG. I cannot possibly allow anyone, even little girls, to be seeing me and staying at home. The first thing you would be doing, you would be scuttling around yodeling the news that you were actually seeing a giant. And then a great giant hunt, a mighty giant look-see, would be starting up all over the world, with the human beings all rummaging for the great giant you saw and getting wildly excited. People would be coming rushing and bushing after me with goodness knows what, and they would be catching me and locking me into a cage to be stared at. They would be putting me into the zoo or the bunkum house with those squiggling hippo dumplings and crocodilians. Sophie knew that what the giant said was true. If any person reported actually having seen a giant haunting the streets of a town at night, there would most certainly be a terrific hula-paloo across the world. I will bet you, the BFG went on, that you would have been splashing the news all over the wonky world. Wouldn't you, if I hadn't wiggled you away? I suppose I would, Sophie said. And that would never do, said the BFG. So what will happen to me now? Sophie asked. If you do go back, you will be telling the world, said the BFG, most likely on the telly bunkum box and the radio squeaker. So you will just have to be staying here with me for the rest of your life. Oh no, cried Sophie. Oh yes, said the BFG. But I am warning you not ever to go whiffling about out of this cave without I is with you, or you will be coming to an ucky, mucky end. I is showing you now who is going to eat you up if they is ever catching even one tiny little glimpse of you. The big friendly giant picked Sophie up off the table and carried her to the cave entrance. He rolled the huge stone to one side and said, Peep out over there, little girl, and tell me what you is seeing. Sophie, sitting on the BFG's hand, peeped out of the cave. The sun was up now and shining fiery hot over the great yellow wasteland with its blue rocks and dead trees. Is you seeing them? The BFG asked. Sophie, squinting through the glare of the sun, saw several tremendous tall figures moving among the rocks, about 500 yards away. 3 or 4 others were sitting quiet, motionless on the rocks themselves. This is giant country, the BFG said. Those is all giants. Everyone. It was a brain-boggling sight. The giants were all naked except for a sort of short skirt around their waists, and their skins were burnt by the sun. But it was the sheer size of each one of them that boggled Sophie's brain so most of all. They were simply colossal, far taller and wider than the big friendly giant upon whose hand she was now sitting. And oh, how ugly they were! Many of them had large bellies. All of them had long arms and big feet. They were too far away for their faces to be seen clearly, and perhaps that was a good thing. What on earth are they doing? Sophie asked. Nothing, said the BFG. That is just mookling and poochling around and waiting for the night to come. Then they will all be galloping off to places where people is living to find their suppers. You mean to Turkey? Sophie said. Bone-crunching giant will be galloping to Turkey. Of course, said the BFG. But the others will be whiffling off to all sorts of flug-away places, like Wellington, for the booty flavor of Panama, for the Haiti taste. Every giant is having his own favorite hunting ground. Ever go to England? Sophie asked. Often, said the BFG. They say the English is tasting ever so wonderfully of crowed scallop. I'm not sure I quite know what that means, Sophie said. Meanings is not important, said the BFG. I cannot be right all the time. Quite often I is left instead of right. And are all those beastly giants over there really going off again tonight to eat people? Sophie asked. All of them is guzzling human beings every night, the BFG answered. All of them, excepting me. That is why you'll be coming to an ucky-mucky end if any of them should ever be getting us gogglers upon you. You would be swallowed up like a piece of frumpkin pie, all in one dollop. But eating people is horrible, Sophie cried. It's frightful. Why doesn't someone stop them? And who, please, is going to be stopping them? Asked the BFG. Wouldn't you? Said Sophie. Never in a pig's whistle, cried the BFG. All of those man-eating giants is enormous and very fierce. This is all at least 2 times my wideness and double my royal highness. Twice as high as you? Cried Sophie. Easily that, said the BFG. You is seeing them in the distance, but just wait till you get them close up. Those giants is at least 50 feet tall with huge muscles and cockles alive. I is the titchy one. I is the runt. 24 feet is puddle nuts in giant country. You mustn't feel bad about that, Sophie said. I think you are just great. Why, even your toes must be as big as sausages. Bigger, said the BFG, looking pleased. They is as big as bumplehammers. How many giants are there out there? Sophie asked. 9 altogether, answered the BFG. That means, said Sophie, that somewhere in the world, every single night, 9 wretched people get carried away and eaten alive? More, said the BFG. It is all depending, you see, on how big the human beings is. Japanese beans is very small, so a giant will need to gobble up about 6 Japanese before he is feeling full up. Others, like the Norway people and the Yankee Doodles, is ever so much bigger, and usually 2 or 3 of those makes a good tuck-in. But do these disgusting giants go to every single country in the world? Sophie asked. All countries, excepting Greece, is getting visited sometime or another, the BFG answered. The country which a giant visits is depending on how he is feeling. If it is very warm weather and a giant is feeling as hot as a sizzle pan, he will probably go galloping far up to the Frisbee North to get himself an Eskimo or 2 to cool him down. Nice fat Eskimo to a giant is like a lovely ice cream lolly to you. I'll take your word for it, Sophie said. And then again, If it is a frosty night, and the giant is frigiding with cold, he will probably point his nose toward the sweltering hotlands to guzzle a few Hottentots to warm him up. How perfectly horrible, Sophie said. Nothing hots a cold giant up like a hot Hottentot, the BFG said. And if you were to put me down on the ground, and I was to walk out among them now, Sophie said, would they really eat me up? Like a whiff swiddle, cried the BFG. And what is more, you were so small they wouldn't even have to chew you. The first one to be seeing you would pick you up in his fingers, and down you'd go like a drop of drain water. Let's go back inside, Sophie said. I hate even watching them.
The Marvelous Ears. Back in the cave, the big friendly giant sat Sophie down once again on the enormous table. Is you quite snugly there in your nightie, he asked. You isn't friggy cold? I'm fine, Sophie said. I cannot help thinking, said the BFG, about your poor mother and father. By now they must be jipping and scumping all over the house, shouting, Hello, hello, where is Sophie gone? I don't have a mother and father, Sophie said. They both died when I was a baby. Oh, you poor little scrumplet, cried the BFG. Is you not missing them very badly? Not really, Sophie said, because I never knew them. You is making me sad, the BFG said, rubbing his eyes. Don't be sad, Sophie said. No one is going to be worrying too much about me. That place you took me from was the village orphanage. We are all orphans in there. You is an orphan? Yes. How many is there in there? 10 of us, Sophie said, all little girls. Was you happy there? The BFG asked. I hated it, Sophie said. The woman who ran it was called Mrs. Clonkers, and if she caught you breaking any of the rules, like getting out of bed at night or not folding up your clothes, you got punished. How was you getting punished? She locked us in the dark cellar for a day and a night without anything to eat or drink. The rotten old rat scrapper, cried the BFG. It was horrid, Sophie said. We used to dread it. There were rats down there, and we could hear them creeping about. The filthy old fizzwiggler, shouted the BFG. That is the horridest thing I is hearing for years. You is making me sadder than ever. All at once, a huge tear that would have filled a bucket rolled down one of BFG's cheeks and fell with a splash on the floor. It made quite a puddle. Sophie watched with astonishment. What a strange and moody creature this is, she thought. One moment he's telling me my head is full of squashed flies, and the next moment his heart is melting for me because Mrs. Clonkers locks us in the cellar. The thing that worries me, Sophie said, is having to stay in this dreadful place for the rest of my life. The orphanage was pretty awful, but I wouldn't have been there forever, would I? All is my fault, the BFG said. I is the one who kid-snatched you. Yet another enormous tear welled from his eyes and splashed to the floor. Now, I come to think of it, I won't actually be here all that long, Sophie said. I is afraid you will, said the BFG. No, I won't, Sophie said. Those brutes out there are bound to catch me sooner or later and have me for tea. I is never letting that happen, said the BFG. For a few moments the cave was silent. Then Sophie said, May I ask you a question? The BFG wiped the tears from his eyes with the back of his hand and gave Sophie a long, thoughtful stare. Shoot away, he said. Would you please tell me what you were doing in our village last night? Why were you poking that long trumpet thing into the Gucci children's bedroom and then blowing through it? Aha, cried the BFG, sitting up suddenly in his chair. Now he is getting nosier than a Parker. And the suitcase you were carrying, Sophie said. Why on earth? What on earth was all that about? The BFG stared suspiciously at the small girl sitting cross-legged at the table. He was asking me to tell you whoopsie big secrets, he said. Secrets that nobody is ever hearing before. I won't tell a soul, Sophie said. I swear it. How could I anyway? I am stuck here for the rest of my life. You could be telling the other giants. No, I couldn't, Sophie said. You told me they would eat me up the moment they saw me. And so they would, said the BFG. You as a human being, and human beings is like strawbunkles and cream to those giants. If they are going to eat me the moment they see me, then I wouldn't have time to tell them anything, would I? You wouldn't, said the BFG. Then why did you say I might? Because I is brimful as buzzburgers, said BFG. If you listen to everything I'm saying, you will be getting an earache. Please tell me what you were doing in our village, Sophie said. I promise you can trust me. Would you teach me how to make an elephant? The BFG asked. What do you mean? I would dearly love to have an elephant to ride on, the BFG said dreamily. I would so much love to have a jumbly big elephant and go riding through the green forest, picking peachy fruits off the trees all day long. This is a sizzling hot, muck-frumping country we is living in. Nothing grows in it except snows cumbers. I would love to go somewhere else and pick peachy fruits in the early morning from the back of the elephant. Sophie was quite moved by this curious statement. Perhaps one day we will get you an elephant, she said, and peachy fruits as well. Now tell me what you were doing in our village. If you is really wanting to know what I am doing in your village, the BFG said, I is blowing a dream into the bedroom of those children. Blowing a dream? Sophie said. What do you mean? I is a dream-blowing giant, the BFG said, when all the other giants is galloping off every what way in which to swallow up human beings. I is scuttling away to other places to blow dreams into the bedrooms of sleeping children. Nice dreams. Lovely golden dreams. Dreams that is giving the dreamers a happy time. Now hang on a minute, Sophie said. Where do you get these dreams? I collect them, said the BFG, waving an arm toward all the rows and rows of bottles on the shelves. I has billions of them. You can't collect a dream, Sophie said. A dream isn't something you can catch a hold of. You is never going to understand about it, the BFG said. That is why I is not wishing to tell you. Oh, please tell me, Sophie said. I will understand. Go on, tell me how you collect dreams. Tell me everything. The BFG settled himself comfortably in his chair and crossed his legs. Dreams, he said, is a very mysterious thing. They is floating around in the air like little wispy, mispy bubbles, and all the time they is searching for sleeping people. Can you see them? Sophie asked. Never at first. Then how do you catch them if you can't see them? Sophie asked. Aha, said the BFG. Now he was getting on to the dark and dusky secrets. I won't tell a soul. I is trusting you, the BFG said. He closed his eyes and sat quite still for a moment when Sophie waited. A dream, he said, as it goes whiffling through the night air, is making a tiny buzzing, humming noise. But this little buzzing hum is so civil or soft it is impossible for human beings to hear it. Can you hear it? The BFG pointed up to his enormous truck-wheeled ears, which he now began to move in and out. He performed this exercise proudly, with a little proud smile on his face. Is you seeing these? He said. How could I miss them? Sophie asked. They may be as looking a bit prosperous to you, said the BFG, but you must believe me when I say they are as a very extra usual ears indeed. They is not to be coughed at. I'm quite sure they're not, Sophie said. They is allowing me to hear absolutely every single twiddling thing. You mean you can hear things I can't hear? You as deaf as a dumpling compared with me, cried the BFG. You is hearing only thumping loud noises with those little earwigs of yours, but I am hearing all the secret whisperings of the world. Such as what? Sophie asked. In your country, he said, I is hearing the footsteps of a ladybird as she walks through the leaf. Honestly, Sophie said, beginning to be impressed. What's more, I is hearing those footsteps very loud, the BFG said. When a ladybird is walking across a leaf, I is hearing her feet going clumpity clumpity clump, like giant's footsteps. Good gracious me, Sophie said. What else can you hear? I is hearing the little ants chittering to each other as they scuttle around in the soil. You mean you can hear ants talking? Every single word, said the BFG, although I is not exactly understanding their language. Go on, Sophie said. Sometimes on a very clear night, the BFG said, and if I is swiggling my ears in the right direction, and here he swiveled his great ears upwards so they were facing the ceiling. If I is swiggling them like this and the night is very clear, I is sometimes hearing faraway music coming from the stars in the sky. A queer little shiver passed through Sophie's body. She sat very quiet, waiting for more. My ears is what told me you was watching me out of your window last night, the BFG said. But I didn't make a sound, Sophie said. I was hearing your heart beating across the road, the BFG said, loud as a drum. Go on, Sophie said, please. I can hear plants and trees. Do they talk? Sophie asked. They is not exactly talking, the BFG said, but they is making noises. For instance, if I come along and I is picking a lovely flower, if I is twisting the stem of a flower till it breaks and the plant is screaming, I can hear it screaming and screaming very clear. You don't mean it, Sophie cried. How awful! It is screaming just like you would be screaming if someone was twisting your arm right off. Is that really true? Sophie asked. You think I was fiddling you? It is rather hard to believe. Then I is stopping right here, said the BFG sharply. I is not wishing to be called a fibster. Oh, no, I'm not calling you anything, Sophie cried. I believe you. I do, really. Please go on. The BFG gave her a long, hard stare. Sophie looked right back at him, her face open to his. I believe you, she said. She had offended him. She could see that. I wouldn't ever be fibbing to you, he said. I know you wouldn't, Sophie said, but you must understand that it isn't easy to believe such amazing things straight away. I understand that, the BFG said. So do please forgive me and go on, she said. He waited a while longer and then he said, it is the same with the trees as it is with the flowers. If I is chopping an axe to the trunk of a big tree, I is hearing a terrible sound coming from inside the heart of the tree. What sort of sound? Sophie asked. A soft moaning sound, the BFG said. It is like the sound of an old man when he is dying slowly. He paused. The cave went very silent. Trees is living and growing just like you and me, he said. They is alive. So is plants. He was sitting very straight in his chair now, his hands clasped tightly together in front of him. His face was bright, his eyes round and bright as two stars. Such wonderful and terrible sounds I is hearing, he said. Some of them you would never wish to be hearing yourself, but some is like glorious music. He seemed almost to be transfigured by the excitement of his thoughts. His face was beautiful in its blaze of emotions. Tell me some more about them, Sophie said. You just ought to be hearing the little mices talking, he said. Little mices is always talking to each other, and I is hearing them loud like my own voice. What do they say? Only the mices know that, he said. Spiders is also talking a great deal. You might not be thinking it, but spiders is the most tremendous natterboxes. When they is spinning their webs, they are singing the whole time. They is singing sweeter than a nightingale. What else do you hear? Who else do you hear? Sophie asked. One of the biggest chat bags is the caterpillars. What do they say? He is arguing all the time about who is going to be the prettiest butterfly. That is all they ever talk about. Is there a dream floating around in here now? Sophie asked. The BFG moved his great ears this way and that, listening intently. He shook his head. There is no dream in here, he said, except for the bottles. I has a special place to go for catching dreams. They is not often come into giant countries. How do you catch them? The same way you is catching butterflies, the BFG answered, with a net. He stood up and crossed over to the corner of the cave where his pole was leaning against the wall. The pole was about 30 feet long, and there was a net at the end of it. Here is the dream catcher, he said, grasping the pole in one hand. Every morning, I is going out and snitching new dreams to put in my bottles. Suddenly, he seemed to lose interest in the conversation. I is getting hungry, he said. It is time for eats.
Hi, Star Leaders. Here is the Snozcumbers chapter. But if you don't eat people like all the others, Sophie said, then what do you live on? That was a squelching, tricky problem around here, the BFG answered. In this slosh-flunking giant country, happy eats like pineapples and pigwinkles is simply not growing. Nothing is growing except for one extremely icky poo vegetable. It is called a snozcumber. The snozcumber, cried Sophie. There's no such thing. The BFG looked at Sophie and smiled, showing about 20 of his square white teeth. Yesterday, he said, we was not believing in giants, was we? Today, we is not believing in snozcumbers. Just because we happen not to have actually seen something with our own two little winkles, we think it is not existing. What about, for instance, the great squizzly Scotch hopper? I beg your pardon, Sophie said. And the humplecrimp? What's that? Sophie said. And the rap rascal? The what? Sophie said. And the crumpscuttle? Are they animals? Sophie said. They is common animals, said the BFG contemptuously. I is not a very well-known all giant myself, but it seems to me that you is an absolutely know-nothing human being. Your brain is full of rotten wool. You mean cotton wool? Sophie said. What I mean and what I say is two different things, the BFG announced rather grandly. I will now show you a snozcumber. The BFG flung open a massive cupboard and took out the weirdest looking thing Sophie had ever seen. It was about half as long, again, as an ordinary man, but was much thicker. It was as thick around its girth as a perambulator. It was black with white stripes along its length, and it was covered all over with coarse knobbles. Here is the repulsant snozcumber, cried the BFG, waving it about. I squoggle it. I mispise it. I dispunge it. But because I is refusing to gobble up human beings like the other giants, I must spend my life guzzling up icky poo snozcumbers instead. If I don't, I will be nothing but skin and groans. You mean skin and bones? Sophie said. I know it is bones, the BFG said, but please understand that I cannot be helping it if I sometimes is saying things a little squiggly. I is trying my very best all the time. The big friendly giant looked suddenly so forlorn that Sophie got quite upset. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't mean to be rude. There never was any schools to teach me talking in giant country, the BFG said sadly. But couldn't your mother have taught you? Sophie asked. My mother, cried the BFG. Giants don't have mothers. Surely you is knowing that. I did not know that, Sophie said. Whoever heard of a woman giant? Shouted the BFG, waving the snozcumber around his head like a lasso. There never was a woman giant, and there never will be one. Giants is always men. Sophie felt herself getting a little muddled. In that case, she said, how were you born? Giants isn't born, the BFG answered. Giants appears, and that's all there is to it. They simply appears, the same way as the sun and the stars. And when did you appear? Sophie asked. Now, how on earth could I be knowing a thing like that? Said the BFG. It was so long ago I couldn't count. You mean you don't even know how old you are? No giant is knowing that, the BFG said. All I is knowing about myself is that I is very old, very, very old and crumply, perhaps as old as the earth. What happens when a giant dies? Sophie asked. Giants is never dying, the BFG answered. Sometimes and quite suddenly, a giant is disappearing and nobody is ever knowing where he goes to. But mostly us giants is simply going on and on like whiffsy time twiddlers. The BFG was still holding the awesome snozcumber in his right hand, and now he put one end into his mouth and bit off a huge hunk of it. He started crunching it up, and the noise he made was like the crunching of lumps of ice. It's filthing, he sputtered, speaking with his mouth full and spraying large pieces of snozcumber like bullets in Sophie's direction. Sophie hopped around on the tabletop, ducking out of the way. It's disgusterous, the BFG gurgled. It's sickable. It's rotsome. It's maggot-wise. Try it yourself, this foulsome snozcumber. No, thank you, Sophie said, backing away. It's all you're going to be guzzling around here from now on, so you might as well get used to it, said the BFG. Go on, you snipsy little winkle. Have a go. Sophie took a small nibble. Oh, she sputtered. Oh, no. Oh, gosh. Oh, help. She spat it out quickly. It tastes of frog skins, she gasped, and rotten fish. Worse than that, cried the BFG, roaring with laughter. To me, it is tasting of clock coaches and slime wanglers. Do we really have to eat it? Sophie said. You do, unless you is wanting to become so thin you will be disappearing into a thick ear. Into thin air? Sophie said. A thick ear is something quite different. Once again, that sad, winsome look came into the BFG's eyes. Words, he said, is oh such a twitch-tickling problem to me all my life. So you must simply try to be patient and stop squibbling. As I am telling you before, I know exactly what words I am wanting to say, but somehow or other, they is always getting squiddled around. That happens to everyone, Sophie said. Not like it happens to me, the BFG said. I is speaking the most terrible wigglish. I think you speak beautifully, Sophie said. You do? Cried the BFG, suddenly brightening. You really do? Simply beautifully, Sophie repeated. Well, that is the nicest present anybody is ever giving me in my whole life, cried the BFG. Are you sure you is not twiddling my leg? Of course not, Sophie said. I just love the way you talk. How wondercrump, cried the BFG, still beaming. How whoopsie splunkers. How absolutely squiffling. I is all of a stutter. Listen, Sophie said, we don't have to eat snozcumbers. In the fields around our village, there are all sorts of lovely vegetables, like cauliflowers and carrots. Why don't you get some of those next time you go visiting? The BFG raised his great head proudly in the air. I is a very honorable giant, he said. I would rather be chewing up some rotsome snozcumbers than snitching things from other people. You stole me, Sophie said. I did not steal you very much, said the BFG, smiling gently. After all, you is only a tiny little girl.